Have you ever heard of a barefoot girl running wild across the meadows of Bavaria, who would one day become the empress of a mighty empire? She wasn't meant to be chosen. She wasn't the perfect bride her family prepared, yet in a single glance she captured the heart of Emperor Franz Joseph. But this is no fairy tale with a happy ending. Behind the glittering jewels and the dazzling wedding gowns lay crushing duty, suffocating court life, and a destiny steeped in tragedy. This is not just the love story of an emperor and a girl. This is the journey from the green fields of Bavaria to a throne heavy with sorrow and a fate sealed on the shores of Lake Geneva. Join me in Part 1, The Bavarian Girl, where it all begins.
The Bavarian Girl. A clear morning in Possenhofen, Bavaria. The sky stretched wide. The mist-covered mountains mirrored in the still waters of Lake Starnberg. In this setting, a barefoot girl ran across the meadow, her long hair flying in the wind, her eyes as bright and clear as the lake itself. This was Elisabeth, or Sisi, the third daughter of Duke Maximilian of Bavaria and Duchess Ludovica. Few could have imagined that this wild, spirited girl, far removed from courtly discipline, would one day become the legendary Empress of the Habsburg Empire. Her family was not at the center of power. Her father, Duke Maximilian, was known for his eccentric and bohemian nature, loving freedom far more than noble ceremony. He would often take his children fishing, riding, or climbing in the mountains, raising them close to nature rather than confining them to the strict etiquette of aristocracy. Her mother, Duchess Ludovica, was the opposite, disciplined, ambitious, and determined that her children should marry well and elevate the family's standing. Between these two extremes, Elisabeth grew up both wild and dreamy, carrying within her a quiet sense of insecurity. Among the children, Ludovica placed her greatest hopes in Helene, Sisi's elder sister. Helene had been carefully trained to embody the perfect princess, pious, modest, and obedient. Ludovica's plan was clear: to marry Helene to the young Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, making her daughter empress and drawing their family into the heart of European power. Elisabeth, by contrast, was never considered a candidate for such a destiny. She was simply the little sister, with rosy cheeks and a mischievous smile. But history often delights in irony. In the summer of 1853, Ludovica took Helene and Elisabeth to Ischl, where Emperor Franz Joseph was to formally meet his intended bride. Helene arrived in a strict and proper manner, prepared for the arranged marriage. Elisabeth, just 15 years old, came almost as an afterthought, wearing a simple dress, her hair loosely braided, her demeanor untouched by courtly polish. Yet when Franz Joseph saw her, everything changed. It was not Helene, but Elisabeth, with her natural beauty, bright eyes, and fresh spirit like the mountain breeze, who captured the emperor's heart. It is said that Franz Joseph decided in that very moment, "This will be my bride." The choice shocked the Viennese court. Nobles, advisors, even his formidable mother, Archduchess Sophie, protested that Elisabeth was far too young and utterly unprepared for the role of empress. But Franz Joseph stood firm. He declared his love openly, and insisted he would marry Elisabeth, not Helene, not anyone else. For Elisabeth, the decision was both stunning and frightening. She loved her freedom, her horseback rides by the lake, afternoons of poetry and harp playing in quiet solitude. Now she was destined to become empress of a vast empire, burdened with duty, bound by protocol, and thrust into a rigid, unfamiliar world. As preparations for the imperial wedding began, the young girl from Possenhofen realized that her carefree childhood had ended forever. Vienna, spring of 1854, the city of music and empire, prepared for a spectacle unlike any other. The Habsburg court announced the engagement of Emperor Franz Joseph and Duchess Elisabeth of Bavaria, not Helene, the carefully groomed elder sister, but the 15-year-old girl whose natural grace had unexpectedly captured the emperor's heart. The news spread quickly across Europe, sparking fascination, gossip, and controversy. For Elisabeth, or Sisi as she was called in private, the engagement was overwhelming. Barely out of childhood, she was suddenly the center of diplomatic attention. Her portrait circulated across the continent, her future dissected in salons and embassies alike. While others whispered of politics, alliances, and dynastic power, Sisi herself felt only a storm of confusion. She had not been raised for this, she had not been prepared. Where Helene had memorized etiquette and prayers, Sisi had spent her days climbing trees and scribbling poetry, and yet destiny had chosen her. The Viennese court, rigid and steeped in tradition, greeted the match with unease. Archduchess Sophie, the emperor's mother, was especially displeased. She had orchestrated the marriage to Helene with precision, seeking a dutiful and pliant daughter-in-law who would uphold the grandeur of the dynasty. Instead, she found herself faced with Elisabeth beautiful, certainly, but unpolished, shy, and in Sophie's eyes, far too young. Yet even Sophie could not deny her son's resolve. Franz Joseph was in love, and his word was law. On the 24th of April, 1854, the imperial wedding took place at the Augustinian church in Vienna. The streets overflowed with people, eager to catch a glimpse of the Bavarian girl who had enchanted their emperor. Bells rang, cannons roared, and flower petals rained down upon the golden carriages. Franz Joseph, resplendent in his uniform, looked every inch the ruler of a vast empire. Beside him, Elisabeth, pale and trembling beneath her crown of jewels, seemed more a frightened child than a bride. The ceremony dazzled with pageantry, velvet and ermine, incense and organ music, endless bows and ritual, yet beneath the surface, tension rippled. Courtiers whispered that the new empress was too fragile, too untrained, too young to bear the crushing weight of the Habsburg crown. Others, however, looked at her luminous beauty and saw not weakness but a symbol of renewal, a fresh blossom for an ancient dynasty. For Franz Joseph, the day was triumph. He had followed his heart and married the woman he adored. For Elisabeth, it was the beginning of a long ordeal. From the moment the vows were spoken, she ceased to belong to herself. She belonged to the empire, to its traditions, and above all, to Archduchess Sophie, who wasted no time in asserting dominance. At the wedding feast, as courtiers toasted the radiant young empress, Sophie was already planning her education, her duties, her future as mother of heirs. That night, in the gilded halls of the Hofburg Palace, Sisi began to understand the scale of the transformation. Only days earlier, she had been a Bavarian duke's daughter, running barefoot along the shores of Lake Starnberg. Now, she was consort to the most powerful monarch in Central Europe. The crown glittered on her brow, but it felt heavy, crushing, almost suffocating. It was said that when the festivities ended, Elisabeth withdrew quietly, her eyes filled not with triumph but with tears. She was Empress of Austria, but in her heart, she still longed for the freedom of the mountains, the air of Bavaria, the girlhood that had been taken from her. The honeymoon of fairy tales never came. When the wedding festivities ended, Elisabeth, now Empress of Austria, crossed the threshold of the Hofburg Palace, and with it, she crossed into a new world. The Hofburg was not merely a residence, it was a labyrinth of corridors, salons, chapels, and chambers, a living monument to centuries of Habsburg rule. Its stone walls dripped with history, its chandeliers blazed with imperial majesty, and yet, for Elisabeth, it felt less like a palace than a gilded prison. From the first day, she encountered the iron grip of court protocol. Every action, every gesture, was bound by rules. She could not speak freely, eat freely, or even breathe freely without observation. Her clothing, chosen by attendants, had to follow strict codes. Her daily schedule was set to the minute. Even her walks in the gardens were conducted under the watchful eyes of chaperones. The young girl who once roamed the Bavarian hills on horseback, hair loose in the wind, now moved like a porcelain doll in an endless performance. At the center of this suffocating world stood Archduchess Sophie, Franz Joseph's formidable mother. Stern, disciplined, and convinced of her duty to safeguard the dynasty, Sophie quickly asserted control over her new daughter-in-law. Elisabeth, in her eyes, was immature, undisciplined, and in desperate need of molding. "She is a child," Sophie reportedly confided, "and children must be guided." To Elisabeth, it felt less like guidance and more like domination. The strain grew heavier with the arrival of her first children. Sophie, dismissing Elisabeth as unfit to raise heirs, took direct control of their upbringing. The royal nursery was placed under her authority, and Elisabeth was relegated to the role of a distant visitor in her own children's lives. It was a wound that cut deeply, leaving her feeling powerless and humiliated. Later, she would confess in her diaries that this was the greatest sorrow of her life, to be separated from her children, not by death, but by the will of another. Court life itself was relentless. Endless ceremonies, banquets, audiences, and formal appearances filled her days. The empress was expected to be the radiant ornament of the monarchy, a symbol of beauty and grace who could charm foreign dignitaries and inspire loyalty in the people. And indeed, Elisabeth's striking appearance, her tall, slender figure, her flowing hair, her luminous eyes, quickly became the talk of Europe. Portraits of her were in high demand, and she began to be celebrated as one of the most beautiful women of her age. But beauty, for Elisabeth, became another prison. The court scrutinized her endlessly. Whispers circulated about her shyness, her reluctance to conform, her fragile health. The more she retreated inward, the more they gossiped. She developed strict routines of self-discipline, daily riding, obsessive attention to her figure, hours devoted to grooming her legendary hair. These rituals were her rebellion, her way of carving out some measure of control in a life that allowed her none. Franz Joseph, devoted as he was, could not protect her from the machinery of the court. He loved Elisabeth sincerely, but he was also an emperor bound by duty, tradition, and the expectations of his mother. Often, he stood caught between wife and dynasty, unable or unwilling to defy Sophie's will. His absences, consumed by the burdens of rule, left Elisabeth increasingly isolated. And so, within the glittering halls of Vienna, the empress began to wither. The girl who once laughed in the gardens of Bavaria now walked solemnly through marble corridors, her eyes often cast downward, her words growing fewer. She had been placed at the pinnacle of power, yet she felt powerless. She had been given a crown, yet it weighed upon her like a chain. The world saw her as a fairy tale empress. But behind the palace walls, Elisabeth was already a restless soul, trapped between the role she was forced to play and the freedom she could never forget. The Empress of Austria had everything the world believed should bring happiness: a crown of gold, gowns embroidered with jewels, and the admiration of millions. And yet, within the marble chambers of the Hofburg, Elisabeth felt suffocated. She was not born for protocol and politics. She was born for freedom, for open skies, for galloping horses and wild winds. The deeper she sank into the rigid world of Vienna, the more violently her spirit resisted. From the earliest days of her marriage, Elisabeth showed signs of rebellion. She loathed the endless etiquette of court life, the stiff ceremonies, the carefully rehearsed greetings, the hours of standing motionless during formal audiences. She despised the artifice, the polished smiles, the calculated words, the masks everyone seemed to wear. When the court gathered in glittering salons to gossip or scheme, she longed instead for silence, for solitude, for nature. Her defiance showed itself in subtle ways. She would slip away from balls and banquets, vanishing into her private apartments. She refused to engage in petty rivalries with archduchesses who measured influence in jewels and whispers. Most daring of all, she began to assert her independence in matters of health and body. Elisabeth cultivated an intense discipline, rising early, riding daily, walking for miles, fasting, and maintaining a figure so slim that rumors of illness spread across Europe. Her legendary beauty, so celebrated by the people, became both her shield and her prison. To sustain it, she submitted herself to punishing routines, hours of exercise, baths in olive oil, elaborate rituals for her hair that could last half a day. Her flowing chestnut locks, cascading to her knees, became iconic, but they also trapped her in a cycle of perfection. Every detail of her appearance was scrutinized by the court and the press. She could never falter, never age, never reveal her exhaustion. Behind the glamour, she was fighting to keep hold of something the court could not control: her own image, her own self. But her deepest rebellions came not from vanity, but from longing. Elisabeth craved escape from the suffocating atmosphere of Vienna. Whenever she could, she fled the Hofburg. She rode for hours through the woods and meadows, seeking solitude in speed and distance. Horses became her salvation. In the saddle, she was no longer an empress bound by ritual. She was Sisi again, the Bavarian girl who had once ridden with her father across lakes and mountains. She also began to travel restlessly, seeking refuge in Hungary, in the spas of the Alps, in foreign lands where court protocol had less power to bind her. The people of Hungary, in particular, stirred her sympathy. She admired their proud independence, their defiance of Austrian dominance, their spirit of resistance. In their struggle, she saw a reflection of her own. The connection would later blossom into one of the most important chapters of her reign. Yet, even as she sought escape, Elisabeth's inner struggles deepened. The loss of control over her children, claimed by Archduchess Sophie, left her heart heavy with grief. She poured her frustrations into her diaries and poetry, where her melancholy voice echoed themes of captivity, fragility, and death. Her writings reveal a soul aching for freedom, aching for meaning, aching to break free of the role imposed upon her. Franz Joseph watched her drifting with helpless devotion. He loved her with constancy, but he could not understand her turmoil. For him, duty was life. For her, duty was a chain. When he bent under the weight of empire, he found strength in tradition. When she bent under it, she sought wings. The world saw her as the radiant star of the Habsburg court, a living jewel of the monarchy. But beneath the glitter, Elisabeth was restless, haunted, and increasingly untethered. Her spirit, too wild for the cage of empire, was beginning to strain at its bars, and the harder the court pressed to hold her, the further she would seek to escape. If Vienna was a cage, then Hungary was Elisabeth's open sky. From the moment she first crossed the plains of that proud kingdom, she felt a kinship she had never known at the Austrian court. The land was vast, untamed, and steeped in traditions that resisted the suffocating uniformity of Habsburg rule. To Sisi, Hungary was not simply a territory of the empire, it was a mirror of her own restless soul, a nation longing for freedom, straining against chains. The Hungarian people, too, responded to her with an affection that astonished the court in Vienna. Where other empresses had been viewed with suspicion or cold respect, Elisabeth was welcomed with warmth. She admired their music, their language, their fiery spirit. She listened to their grievances, sympathized with their demands, and began to wear their national dress in public, a gesture that electrified her hosts and scandalized her in-laws. In Elisabeth, the Hungarians saw not just an empress, but an ally. It was in Hungary that Elisabeth found her first taste of true political influence. Until then, her role in governance had been little more than ceremonial, her voice muffled by Franz Joseph's ministers and the iron grip of Archduchess Sophie. But Hungary was different. The people trusted her, confided in her, and believed she could be the bridge between their nation and the imperial throne. Elisabeth, who had always felt powerless in Vienna, now discovered the intoxicating possibility of using her voice for something greater than herself. She threw herself into the cause of reconciliation. The wounds of 1848, when Hungary had risen in revolution against Austria and been brutally crushed, were still raw. Many Hungarians still dreamed of independence. Franz Joseph, rigid and cautious, clung to central authority, but Elisabeth urged him to compromise. She spoke to him not as a politician, but as a wife, appealing to his heart rather than his reason. Slowly, her influence began to soften his stance. For the first time, Elisabeth's restlessness found purpose. Her long rides across the Hungarian plains became symbols of her bond with the people. She was not the porcelain Empress of Vienna here, but a queen of the saddle, galloping freely with the Magyar aristocracy, laughing and flushed with the joy of motion. Chroniclers described her as radiant in Hungarian costume, her hair braided with ribbons, her face alight with vitality that seemed absent in Vienna. Her attachment to Hungary deepened into lasting relationships. Count Gyula Andrassy, a leading Hungarian statesman, became one of her closest confidants. Handsome, passionate, and dedicated to his homeland, Andrassy was rumored to be more than a friend. Whether the whispers were true or not, what mattered was the political alliance that blossomed between them. Through Elisabeth, Andrassy found a channel to the emperor's ear. Through Andrassy, Elisabeth found a cause worthy of her devotion. Her efforts would bear historic fruit in the years to come, laying the groundwork for the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867. But even before that moment, Elisabeth had already secured her place in the hearts of the Hungarian people. They called her their guardian angel, the Empress who dared to understand them when Vienna would not. For Elisabeth, Hungary was more than politics. It was a refuge, a sanctuary where she could breathe without courtly suffocation. Here, she was free to be herself, to ride, to write, to laugh, to live. The contrast with Vienna could not have been greater. In Austria, she was watched, measured, and judged. In Hungary, she was embraced. Yet even this freedom carried shadows. The more Elisabeth fled to Hungary, the more alienated she became from her own husband and his court. Vienna whispered that she had abandoned her duties. Archduchess Sophie seethed at her influence. Franz Joseph, though devoted, could not always follow her into her new world. Love bound them, but politics and temperament kept them apart. Still, in Hungary, Elisabeth found the closest thing to peace she would ever know. In its vast plains and proud people, she discovered both refuge and power. For a restless empress who had felt powerless all her life, it was intoxicating. But peace in Elisabeth's world was always fleeting. Storms would follow, shadows would grow, and tragedy would soon reclaim its hold on her fragile heart. By the first decade of the 1402, the French court had grown accustomed to the troubling reality of Charles VI's condition. He was a king of extremes, sometimes lucid and compassionate, at other times withdrawn into fears and delusions that unsettled even those closest to him. The most haunting of these was his belief that his body was made of glass. The delusion reshaped daily life at court. Courtiers learned to approach him with great care, moving quietly, speaking softly, and avoiding sudden gestures. Before he sat, cushions were carefully arranged to protect him. Chroniclers tell of how he sometimes clutched his arms and legs, convinced they might break with the slightest pressure. To his attendants, these moments were not simply strange, they revealed how fragile the monarchy itself had become. In medieval Europe, a king was expected to be a figure of strength and certainty. Yet in Charles, France saw a sovereign who feared even physical contact. To some, it was a metaphor for the nation itself, a kingdom strained by war, plague, and taxation, vulnerable to breaking under its own burdens. His frailty, whether of mind or of body, was mirrored in the fragility of France. Despite these struggles, Charles was not entirely absent from governance. In rare moments of clarity, he showed deep remorse for his failings, prayed fervently, and sought to guide his council with wisdom. But these periods never lasted. When illness returned, influence slipped quickly into the hands of powerful relatives and factions. His brother, Louis of Orléans, and his cousin, John the Fearless of Burgundy, both vied for authority. Each claimed to act in the name of the king, and each tried to use his condition as justification for their growing control. For the people of Paris, rumors about their monarch were impossible to ignore. Whispers spread that he wandered his palace in disheveled clothing, that he resisted bathing, and that his servants feared even to touch him. To many struggling with famine and taxation, such stories painted a portrait not of majesty, but of a kingdom adrift. Meanwhile, rival factions hardened into political camps. Supporters of the Duke of Orléans formed what became known as the Armagnac Party, while the followers of Burgundy rallied behind John the Fearless. What began as competition for influence over a vulnerable monarch soon escalated into open hostility. France, already weakened by the ongoing 100 Years' War, now faced the looming shadow of civil war. And at the heart of it all was Charles VI, the king who believed himself fragile. His personal fears had become a symbol of national fragility, a reminder that a kingdom's stability rested heavily on the strength of its ruler. With the monarchy weakened, the duke circled, and France itself stood on the edge of fracture. The belief that his body was made of glass was more than a private sorrow. It was a reflection of the deep cracks in the French crown, cracks that were widening into a struggle that would soon engulf the entire realm. After the catastrophe at Mayerling, Elisabeth of Austria was never the same. Already known for her melancholy and restless spirit, the death of her beloved son Rudolf plunged her into a grief so deep that she seemed to withdraw entirely from life. From 1889 onward, the Empress became a wanderer, a queen in black, roaming the world like a restless shadow, unable to find peace in the empire she was meant to adorn. Elisabeth had long despised the rigid protocols of the Viennese court, but now she abandoned them altogether. She refused public celebrations, rarely attended official duties, and almost never appeared beside her husband, Emperor Franz Joseph. Dressed always in black gowns of heavy silk or mourning crepe, she became a figure of perpetual sorrow. To the people of Austria-Hungary, she was no longer the radiant Sisi of their youth, but the grieving Black Empress, shrouded in mystery and sorrow. Her grief was expressed not only in clothing but in constant movement. Elisabeth could not bear to remain still. She travelled endlessly to Hungary, Switzerland, England, Ireland, Italy, and even to Greece, where she felt a deep connection to the myths and landscapes of antiquity. She roamed the Mediterranean on yachts, rode horses across the plains of Ireland, and sought refuge in spas and quiet seaside towns. To those who observed her, it seemed as though she was trying to outrun her grief, as if constant motion could somehow erase the image of her son's lifeless body at Mayerling. Her wanderings were accompanied by a fierce desire for privacy. She often travelled incognito, under false names, avoiding photographers and journalists who longed to capture the elusive empress. Guards and attendants who once surrounded her were reduced to a small circle of loyal companions. Even when she stayed in palaces or grand estates, Elisabeth seemed to float above the luxuries of royalty, preferring solitude, poetry, and the freedom of open landscapes. Elisabeth's beauty, legendary across Europe, became a burden to her as she aged. Obsessed with maintaining her figure, she adhered to strict diets and hours of exercise, even in her 50s. She walked for miles each day, sometimes outpacing her attendants, and rode horseback with the stamina of a young woman. Her famous hair, a cascade of chestnut locks that reached to her ankles, remained her crowning glory. Though she increasingly hid her face from portraits and paintings, unwilling to let the public see the marks of time upon her features, she cultivated an aura of myth, a woman both present and absent, haunting Europe with her beauty and sorrow. Her travels often reflected her intellectual passions as well. In Greece, she immersed herself in classical literature, commissioned statues of Achilles, and surrounded herself with Greek tutors. At her palace of Achilleon on Corfu, she filled the gardens with mythological sculptures, imagining herself as a figure of tragic antiquity. To many, she appeared less an empress of a modern empire, and more like a wandering heroine from ancient legend, mourning her fate under the indifferent gaze of the gods. But beneath the surface, Elisabeth's wanderings revealed a soul consumed by loss. She avoided Vienna not only because it reminded her of court duties, but because every hall, every chapel, every garden carried memories of Rudolph. Her grief hardened into a philosophy of detachment. She insisted she no longer belonged to the world of the living, that she was only waiting for death to release her. And yet, despite her withdrawal, Elisabeth continued to inspire fascination. Wherever she went, crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of the mysterious Empress in Black. She had become, in her own lifetime, a legend, a tragic figure, embodying the sorrow of a dynasty that seemed cursed by fate. Her husband, Franz Joseph, remained tethered to duty in Vienna, a lonely figure at the center of a crumbling empire. Though their marriage had grown distant, he never ceased to care for her, writing letters, sending gifts, and yearning for her return. But Elisabeth never returned for long. Her place was no longer in the gilded halls of Habsburg or Schönbrunn, but in the wide world beyond, where she could disappear into mountains, seas, and anonymous crowds. By the final decade of her life, Elisabeth seemed less an empress than a ghost, moving from country to country with the sorrow of Mayerling etched permanently upon her face. Her exile was not one of politics, but of the heart, a refusal to live within the structures of a world that had stolen her son, her joy, and her sense of belonging. The wandering empress had become a symbol of escape and mourning, a queen who chose not to reign but to vanish, leaving behind only glimpses of her shadow as she moved endlessly across Europe. Yet destiny had one final turn prepared for her, one that would end her wandering in the most sudden and violent way imaginable. By the late 1892, Elisabeth of Austria had become more legend than monarch. Known as the Wandering Empress, she drifted from place to place, always cloaked in black, a solitary figure fleeing memories that haunted her. Her fame across Europe was immense, but so was her vulnerability. Elisabeth traveled with only minimal security, often incognito, determined to escape the suffocating weight of court life. It was this very desire for freedom, that placed her directly in the path of tragedy. In September 1898, Elisabeth arrived in Geneva, Switzerland, a city she loved for its beauty and relative anonymity. She planned a quiet stay at the Hotel Beau Rivage, accompanied by a single lady in waiting. Her presence in the city was not meant to draw attention. She registered under a false name, as she often did. But the secret of her arrival did not hold for long. The Empress of Austria, famed throughout Europe, could never remain invisible for long. At the same time, Geneva had become a gathering place for anarchists. Disillusioned with monarchy, wealth, and hierarchy, these radicals plotted against symbols of imperial power. Among them was an Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchesi. He was not wealthy, nor powerful, nor even well connected to organized groups. He was, in truth, a drifter angry at the world, eager to strike a blow that would make him famous. His plan had not originally been to target Elisabeth. In fact, he had hoped to assassinate the Duke of Orléans, a pretender to the French throne. But when he discovered the Empress of Austria was in Geneva, he shifted his sights. On the morning of the 10th of September, 1898, Elisabeth prepared to board a steamer across Lake Geneva. Dressed in black, as always, with her face veiled, she walked arm in arm with her lady-in-waiting along the lakeside promenade. Her appearance was so discreet that few recognized her as royalty. But Lucchesi was waiting. Concealing a sharpened needle file, he rushed at the two women. In one swift motion, he struck Elisabeth in the chest, driving the thin blade directly into her heart. At first, the wound seemed minor. The Empress stumbled but regained her footing. Witnesses thought she had only been shoved. She even managed to walk back toward the pier, insisting she was fine. But moments later, her strength failed. She collapsed unconscious, her face growing pale, her breath shallow. Carried back to the Hotel Beau Rivage, doctors were summoned in haste. Only when her corset was unlaced did they discover the truth. The blade had pierced her heart. By then, it was too late. Elisabeth, Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary, was dead within the hour. Her death sent shockwaves across Europe. News spread rapidly, and in Vienna, the grief was overwhelming. Emperor Franz Joseph, who had endured decades of loneliness in marriage, yet still cared deeply for his wife, was devastated. "You don't know how much I loved this woman," he whispered upon hearing the news. To the Austrian people, Elisabeth had been a paradox, distant, reclusive, and mysterious, yet beloved for her beauty, her wit, and her tragic aura. Now, in her violent end, she became a martyr of fate, her legend sealed in blood. Lucchesi, arrested immediately, showed no remorse. To him, Elisabeth was simply a symbol, a crown, a palace, an empire. He declared he had wished to kill a sovereign, any sovereign, but to millions he had taken far more. He had destroyed the living myth of Sisi, the empress who had wandered the world like a ghost of sorrow. Her funeral in Vienna drew vast crowds. The black-clad city mourned the fairy tale empress who had lived a life of glittering beauty and bottomless grief. Chroniclers compared her to figures of tragic legend, a queen both adored and cursed, fragile yet untouchable. She was buried in the imperial crypt, beside the dynasty that had both imprisoned and defined her. Yet Elisabeth's death was not merely the end of a life, it was a mirror of her existence, sudden, violent, and symbolic. She had long declared she no longer wished to live, that she awaited death as a release. In Geneva, on that quiet lakeside morning, fate answered her. The blade that struck her was not only the act of an assassin, but the closing line of a story written in tragedy from the beginning. The Empress of Austria was gone. But Sisi, the legend of beauty, sorrow, and restless freedom, had only just begun to live in the imagination of Europe. Death often transforms rulers into legends, but in the case of Elisabeth of Austria, Sisi, her assassination in Geneva was less an ending than a beginning. In life, she had been a paradox, both admired and pitied, a woman of extraordinary beauty, yet crushing sorrow. In death, she became immortal, her story woven into the cultural imagination of Europe as one of its greatest romantic tragedies. Almost immediately after her funeral in Vienna, Elisabeth's image began to shift. The newspapers spoke not of an empress detached from politics or a queen wandering in melancholy, but of a tragic heroine, a woman misunderstood by her era, destroyed by fate, yet radiant with a timeless grace. Poems, paintings, and later even songs portrayed her as a fragile star, burning brightly before being extinguished too soon. In Austria and Hungary, where her memory was especially strong, Elisabeth became more than a monarch. In Hungary, she was remembered as the queen who had loved their country, spoken their language, and brokered compromise with her husband during the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867. Statues rose in her honor, depicting her not as a ruler in state robes, but as a gentle, approachable figure, with flowing hair and serene expression. She became, in a sense, the people's queen admired not for her power, but for her humanity. Vienna, meanwhile, carried the weight of her absence like a wound. Emperor Franz Joseph, devastated by her loss, became even more withdrawn. He had lived in the shadow of his stern duty for decades, but Elisabeth had been his only true companion, even in their estrangement. After her death, he kept her rooms at Schönbrunn Palace untouched, a shrine to the woman who had haunted his life as much as she had shared it. For him, Elisabeth's legend was not public myth, but private grief. As the 20th century unfolded, Elisabeth's story evolved again. The rise of cinema and popular culture gave her life a new stage. In the 1952nd, the German actress Romy Schneider starred in the famous Sisi trilogy, a romanticized portrayal that swept across Europe. These films, light and glittering, showed Elisabeth as a fairy tale princess, radiant, kind, rebellious in a charming way, and deeply in love with her emperor. They were wildly successful and wildly inaccurate, but for millions, they cemented Sisi's image not as the haunted wanderer, but as the beautiful empress of fantasy. Historians, however, have long sought to recover the real woman behind the myth. They remind us of her struggles with mental health, her obsession with physical beauty, her strict diets, her loneliness, and her often cold relationship with her children. Elisabeth was not a fairy tale princess, but a complex human being shaped by tragedy and constraint. The glass in her life was not simply a metaphor of fragility, but a prison, the transparent cage of royalty, through which the world saw her but never truly knew her. Yet, perhaps that is why her legend endures. Elisabeth's contradictions, beauty and despair, freedom and captivity, power and helplessness, resonate beyond her time. She became a mirror for Europe's own anxieties at the end of the 19th century, an empire cracking beneath the weight of modernity, traditions unable to contain the chaos of change. In Sisi, Europe saw both its fading romance and its impending doom. Today, Elisabeth's image is everywhere. In Viennese museums, Hungarian squares, operas, novels, and films. Tourists visit her palaces, fascinated not by the political details of the Habsburg dynasty, but by the tragic empress whose spirit still seems to haunt their halls. Her story speaks to universal themes: the cost of beauty, the weight of expectation, the fragility of human happiness. In the end, Elisabeth's greatest power was not as empress, but as myth. She defied the rigid roles of her age, carved her own path through sorrow, and died as she had lived dramatically, unexpectedly, leaving behind questions that could never be answered. And so, Sisi remains, not merely a woman of history, but a legend of Europe, her shadow stretching far beyond the empire that once claimed her. The death of Elisabeth of Austria in 1898 was not just the loss of an empress, it was a foreshadowing of the twilight of an empire. Her assassination in Geneva, shocking though it was, seemed almost symbolic. The life of a woman who had spent decades fleeing her crown was ended by a weapon meant for her title, not for herself. In her passing, Europe sensed the fragility not only of a queen, but of the empire she embodied. The Habsburg monarchy had survived for centuries, but by the late 19th century it was already brittle. Nationalism surged across Europe. Czechs, Hungarians, Italians, and Croats all demanded recognition within the empire's sprawling borders. The Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867 had temporarily quieted Hungarian unrest, but it had also created a precedent: if Hungary could secure autonomy, why not others? In this storm of identities, the monarchy appeared less as a stabilizing force and more as a patchwork quilt fraying at the seams. Elisabeth's personal life had mirrored this political fragility. She had adored Hungary, favoring it above Austria, and had often been accused of neglecting her duties in Vienna. Yet in that partiality, she reflected a truth. The empire was no longer one body, but many, stitched together by tradition rather than true unity. The empress's sympathies exposed cracks in the dynasty, just as her husband's rigid devotion to order tried desperately to hold them together. Franz Joseph carried on for nearly 2 decades after her death, but he was a man increasingly haunted by loss. Elisabeth's assassination was only one of several family tragedies. His brother Maximilian had been executed in Mexico. His son, Crown Prince Rudolf, had died in the infamous Mayerling incident. And later his nephew and heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, would be murdered at Sarajevo in 1914. These cascading blows seemed to curse the Habsburgs, each tragedy another step toward collapse. And indeed, collapse came. In 1918, at the end of World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated, carved into nation-states by the victorious Allies. Franz Joseph himself did not live to see it. He died in 1916, but his long reign, marked by both devotion and rigidity, could not prevent the inevitable. In retrospect, Elisabeth's assassination appeared prophetic. The empire had always been more fragile than it seemed, and like her own life, it ended not in glory but in fracture. Yet Elisabeth's legend survived where her empire did not. Across Austria and Hungary, statues of her still stand. In Vienna, she remains a figure of fascination, a woman who, despite her role, always seemed to stand apart from the machinery of monarchy. In Hungary, she is revered almost as a national heroine, remembered for her sympathy and love for the Hungarian people. Unlike Franz Joseph, who is often recalled as austere and rigid, Elisabeth is remembered with warmth, pity, even affection. Her legacy is double-edged. On one hand, she symbolizes the fragility of monarchy, a queen so burdened by duty and sorrow that she turned away from her throne, leaving her empire to stumble without her. On the other, she embodies the romantic tragedy of Europe itself at the fin de siècle, beautiful, elegant, but heading toward destruction with eyes closed. Today, Elisabeth's story still resonates because it is not only about royalty, but about humanity. She longed for freedom, fought against the confines of expectation, and suffered under pressures she could neither escape nor control. In her, modern audiences see both the cost of power and the yearning for individuality struggles that transcend time. The Habsburg Empire is gone, its palaces now museums, its crown locked in display cases. But Sisi lives on in films, operas, novels, and the imaginations of those who still feel the pull of her story. Her shadow stretches beyond her century, a reminder that empires may fall, but myths endure. Elisabeth of Austria remains what she always was, not just an empress, but a legend, and through her, the memory of a vanished empire lingers fragile as glass, luminous as myth.